Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 93. Back in February 2025, we ran an episode titled The Imperial Presidency. In that episode, we looked at a presidency stretching its boundaries, defying court orders, dismantling agencies, and overriding traditional corruption safeguards, all while our standard checks and balances struggled to keep up. At that time, much of our focus was on the newly minted DOJ efforts and the broader civil service bureaucracy. But as we move through 2026, the battlefield has shifted to a critical center of gravity in American governance, the Department of Justice. For 50 years, the DOJ has operated under a powerful post-Watergate norm, the idea that while it sits within the executive branch, it operates with a degree of independence from direct presidential control to ensure the impartial administration of justice. In 2026, that norm has been explicitly and structurally rejected. The Trump administration argues that an independent DOJ is a constitutional myth. They assert that under Article 2, the president has absolute authority over executive branch agencies. And we've seen the rapid operationalization of that theory. The swift dismissal of federal indictments against political allies, targeted pressure on political opponents, and a massive ideological realignment of the DOJ staff to include the FBI, DEA, ATF, and the U.S. Marshal Service. Is this a radical, unprecedented departure from American history, or is it the culmination of a long-standing vulnerability built into the very design of our system? To help us deconstruct this, we're joined today by a very special guest.
Hi, I'm Alex Lovit. I'm a senior program officer and historian at the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. The Charles F. Kettering Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan foundation focused on inclusive democracy, headquartered in Dayton, Ohio, the home of Charles F. Kettering. And I also host Kettering's podcast, The Context.
Alex Lovit holds a PhD from the University of Michigan. On his show, The Context, a sister podcast in the Democracy Group Network, he regularly engages with Pulitzer Prize-winning authors, major political figures, and top scholars to unpack the roots of modern civic life. He brings that same deep historical lens and sharp analytical insight to our conversation today to help us trace the structural lineage of DOJ powers. From the department's founding in 1870 through the Palmer raids, the Teapot Dome scandal, and Watergate, to understand exactly how we got to the institutional landscape of 2026. Here is our conversation. Alex Lovit, thank you so much for making time for our little program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So as you know, we talked about it before that last year we did this episode titled The Imperial Presidency. And at that time we were kind of looking, the things in the current news were sort of the DOJ efforts and all these efforts, a lot of efforts to sort of scale things back, bringing back some of the civil service ideas of being able to fire everyone without much reason. And this kind of thing in civil service was a big part of it. So we sort of looked at the larger administrative state then. But specifically, we're going to talk more about the DOJ today. So when Congress created the DOJ in 1870, I believe, what was their intent? Like, did they realize they were centralizing this much power under an attorney general, or was it envisioned as something more modest?
Yeah, well, so the Attorney General was there from the beginning. So when it was one of the first cabinet officers, the Constitution doesn't specify what the cabinet officers are going to be, but it mentions there's going to be a cabinet. So that was, one of the very first things Congress did in 1789 is sort of start delineating what are the departments going to be. And Attorney General was there from the start. It was underpaid. It was a part-time position. So basically the entire DOJ was one part-time guy. And the idea was that, lawyers can make money in the private market and, the U.S. government is just one client. So at that point, it was very decentralized. There was one guy in Washington kind of serving as attorney general for the United States as a whole. There were circuit attorneys, prosecutors across the country, and those were not under the attorney general. So the attorney general did not have any authority over all the district attorneys throughout the country. And that could sometimes be a problem because it meant that district attorneys in different districts could make different arguments. The federal government would kind of contradict itself in what it was arguing. But then the reason in 1870 that it was decided to kind of centralize that department and bring those district attorneys under the attorney general and put this whole structure in place in Washington, is, of course, this is in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. So this is a point at which, for one thing, the federal bureaucracy had expanded a lot. So that tends to happen in wartime. You're expanding the military, and then you need a lot of civilians overseeing the military. And then while you're at it, let's just expand the federal government overall. So that had kind of just happened. But also, Congress at that point really did not trust decentralized power, down to the local level. So, half the country had just attempted to secede from the Union. So this idea of kind of district attorneys, often often southern states, without oversight in Washington was suspicious, and they wanted to kind of bring that into a centralized organization.
And as we look through the history of some of these scandals, they seem to fall kind of in this category of either sort of shielding allies from accountability or maybe attacking specific groups. And I know there's references to like the Teapot Dome, and we have Watergate, and there's Palmer raids, and after World War I. So I know about a little bit of those, but only mostly from what you've showed me. And when we look back at those chapters, were these cases of like a few bad actors, or did they expose some of these bigger vulnerabilities?
Yeah, well, it varied. So sometimes it was kind of one bad actor or a small number of bad actors. So Teapot Dome, nobody remembers this anymore, but at the time it was the biggest scandal in American history. Up until Watergate, it was kind of the biggest scandal. And this is in the 1920s. It's under the president is Warren Harding. And the central scandal is not within the DOJ, but so it was the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall was his name, and he basically got caught taking bribes. So he was in charge of leasing federal land to oil companies that they could drill on, and he basically took bribes to lease it at favorable rates to certain companies. So the real corruption, and it was sort of one guy. At the time, there was this idea of the Ohio gang, because Harding and Fall were all from Ohio. And also, Harry Daughtry was the attorney general at the time. He was also part of this Ohio gang. And, he wasn't involved in the core corruption. He probably didn't know about it beforehand, but he did try to help conceal it. And there's a complicated story about his brother ran a bank in Ohio, and then some of the proceeds from this corrupt scheme were being deposited in this bank, and then his brother was refusing to testify in front of Congress. So kind of a whole messy situation. But that's a real case of, when you have the power to investigate crime and criminal activity is within the White House, who's going to investigate it when somebody in the White House commits a crime? So that's an example of that. But that is sort of just one bad apple. In other cases, you mentioned the Palmer raids there. So that was actually just before. So we had a kind of bad record of attorney generals back to back. So the Palmer raids are 1919, 1920. This is Woodrow Wilson as president. And the attorney general is Mitchell Palmer, A. Mitchell Palmer. And it was a time of, this is just after the Bolshevik Revolution, coming out of World War I, and there was a lot of fear of communism. So this is kind of the first Red Scare, the first of several Red Scares in American history. And there were legitimately some anarchists that were committing violence. There was this Italian immigrant, Luigi Galani, who was his followers were mailing bombs across the country, including to the attorney general. Not a few people were killed, not that many, but still it's scary to be sending bombs to the postal service. And so Palmer, the attorney general, and it's a moment of public fear of Bolsheviks. I mean, it's not just that the government is scared; it's the public is really upset and fearful. And Palmer he's a politician himself. He's a former House member. He's has political ambitions, and in part because of that, he sees that boy, I can get famous by being seen to crack down really hard on these communists. And so he ends up arresting 6,000 people across the country. And, this is before a lot of the Miranda warning or any of that. But, real clear power, abuses of power where people are being arrested without warrants, without real evidence, or they're held in jail for months and overcrowded conditions without access to lawyers. So a kind of clear overreach. And that's not just one bad apple, really. That's the whole system seeing, this communist threat and then being willing to infringe on liberties. I'll say one more thing about Palmer. I know I'm going on here, but it turns out when you arrest a bunch of people without much evidence, it's real hard to prosecute them. And so a lot of these folks did end up going free. But he discovered that one group of people that was particularly vulnerable were immigrants, and in fact that he targeted a lot of immigrants because it was this was Russians, Eastern Europeans, Jewish people. These are the people that were being suspected of being communist infiltrators, and so several hundred people ended up being deported with limited due process, but that was a little easier than putting everyone in jail.
In there, you mentioned the idea of if the president or maybe his allies are committing crimes, who's going to prosecute that? And let's just talk about that a little bit, because we sort of see this now, and sometimes it feels like this has never happened before, and this is all new stuff. So I'm curious, like, how new is it? How often or how much have we seen this in the past, where the selective prosecution, the presidents have been protective of their allies, or let's just go with that side of it, of the equation first. And, how different is what we're seeing now?
Well, we have definitely seen it in the past. The Teapot Dome is an example of that, of protecting a political ally. Watergate is an example of that. John Mitchell was the Attorney General under Watergate, under Nixon. And the thing he primarily got in trouble for wasn't being Attorney General. The thing he was also Nixon's campaign manager in 1972. And so not totally clear who knew what, but it seems like Mitchell was probably aware of some dirty tricks being played, including possibly the break into the Watergate Hotel, the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. It was basically an attempt to, hey, let's find out what secrets the political opponents are holding. And then Mitchell does try to cover it up too. So he ends up. There's a crazy story from this where the Watergate story breaks originally, which is just, hey, some guys got arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee, and no one really knows what that means yet. But one of the guys that gets arrested had been part of the committee to reelect the president, and Mitchell's wife, Martha Mitchell, she was kind of a right-wing commentator. She was famous in her own right. And so John Mitchell, the AG, sees that his wife, he's worried that she's going to find out, that he's like, oh, she's going to realize that this guy was connected with us. And so he has her sedated. He has psychiatrists, diagnose her with mental illness, and in an attempt to kind of keep her quiet, he ends up resigning just 1 week after that initial Watergate story broke. But even within that 1 week, he already had taken some steps, had met with Nixon to try to cover up the crime. So that's certainly an example of Attorney General, the Department of Justice failing to investigate. Another example would be Iran-Contra. So once that story breaks, Ed Meese is the Attorney General at that time under Reagan, and some questions about how thorough Ed Meese was in trying to investigate the Iran-Contra affair. But what we're seeing now, I think it's different. I think it's a different scale. I think, for one thing, the widespread pardoning of people with criminal convictions or under criminal prosecution, that is not totally new. That's happened before. But the only thing is, so pardoning, what is it, 1,600 January 6th rioters, pardoning, its first term, Trump pardoned Manafort and just a bunch of Michael Flynn, a bunch of his own sort of people involved in his own campaign. The scale of that, the only thing that compares is after the Civil War, Andrew Johnson is a conservative that is in the White House after Lincoln is assassinated. And Andrew Johnson, the people in Congress are radical Republicans, and they actually are radical. They're really trying to enforce racial equity, and Johnson just wants Southerners back in the country as fast as possible, and he's not on board with any kind of racial justice, and so he just starts handing out pardons left and right. and then ends up, before he leaves office, he just issues a blanket pardon to every Confederate, every former Confederate. So that, that is obviously a bigger scale than what Trump's doing now, but actually somewhat similar, just pardoning everybody that was involved in an insurrection attempt.
And another difference that seems to me there, and again, sometimes we have rose-colored glasses or we just don't remember, is it's so open and so transparent that like no one's trying to cover it up. Like it's not like behind closed doors. He sort of tweets about it and says, "I want you, somebody in the DOJ, to do a thing or arrest a person." And then we obviously, if we see the tweet, there's probably a lot more going on that we don't see, but that seems to be a big difference too. There was never Twitter before, so it would have to be some other way to be public. But I'm curious if that's a difference too, that he just sort of puts it out there that he's going to do this.
Yeah, well, and the selective prosecution of political enemies, I'm sure that has happened in American history. I don't know of a lot of great examples of it. So some of the ways that Trump has very publicly made clear he sees James Comey as an enemy, he would like James Comey to be in jail, and now two attempts to indict James Comey on, in my view, flimsy grounds, and the first one was already thrown out of court. So it does feel like there's a vindictive kind of motive behind it, that's just right out there in the open, as you said. Trump is not tweeting anymore; he's truthing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that is somewhat new. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Justice Department has a lot of powers. I mean, Justice Department can do a lot of things to make people's lives miserable. Most of the time, most of the things that the Justice Department can do end up having a backstop of the courts. So there's a difference between the Justice Department, which is within the executive branch, and the judicial branch, the actual court where these things are tried. So Comey's an example of that. The Justice Department indicts him, it goes to court, the court rules it out, throws it out because it is actually not a strong case. But you don't want to rely too much on that system because you can still really make people's lives miserable just by indicting them. So, even though there's the court to prevent the worst abuses, people's lives can still be ruined for years while they're waiting. And then the pardon power, which you were talking about earlier, is, that's one of the least checked powers in the Constitution. The president can just pardon whoever he wants, and there's no one can overturn that. So, that's a power that, and that's not really within the DOJ. I mean, that's just a power the president has. Traditionally, that's an office in the DOJ is suggesting who to pardon. Trump is pretty much ignoring that office and just making his own decisions.
Right. There's a lot of that would be in this category of norms, that there's a lot of the ways we have been doing things that they aren't really enforced. There's nobody forcing it to be that way. After some of these larger ruptures like Watergate, we had responses to try to build some checks on this, like inspectors generals and ethics officers and some civil service protections. And some of that was with the goal of trying to keep some of these departments more insulated from political pressure. And today we're seeing, kind of reversal of that as much as possible, right? They're trying to really put in, loyalty tests and things like that, and really try to have anyone in the executive branch pretty much be in line with the president's agenda. So I guess how effective, from a historical perspective, how effective have those guardrails been to try to keep these organizations somewhat independent, especially when an administration decides they're going to challenge them?
Well, I think the guardrails have been effective to a limited degree, and those guardrails have changed a lot over time. So Teapot Dome, one of the things that came out of that was Congress is trying to investigate this, this corruption in the White House, in the executive branch. And so Congress is trying to hold hearings and subpoena people. And then there's this legal question of, does Congress have the right to do that? Because they're supposed to be, they're supposed to have powers to investigate, but for legislative purposes. And is this not a legislative purpose? And there's an important Supreme Court ruling that says no, Congress does. Congress can subpoena people, and they can hold people in contempt if they fail to show up, and they can face criminal penalties for that. So that's an important kind of bolstering of Congress's role of oversight, something Congress is not doing a whole lot of lately. After Nixon, a ton of reforms, and partially that is to build independence within the DOJ. So partially, again, it's empowering Congress to do investigations. Partially, it's about, within the DOJ, which is going to be under the executive branch, which is going to be under the president, but still, let's build some independence in there. Let's guarantee some independence in there. And so they create the system of independent counsels. That has changed a bit over the years, but that's basically what Robert Mueller was. So that is a system that has continued to exist, where if there is a investigation happening into the White House itself or the White House staff, then the Department of Justice is supposed to kind of take a step back and create this independent counsel, and then they have their own budget. They can kind of run, they are fairly free of presidential oversight, and so that has been effective to some extent, but it's worth mentioning that Trump really hated that system, and that's why he fired his first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, specifically because Sessions stepped aside and made room for an independent counsel. So yeah, I think the systems have held to varying degrees.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned something like with the Mueller investigation, they may have been protected then, but I mean, subsequently now, Trump is going after anybody that was involved in that investigation. So, and there doesn't seem to be a lot anybody can do about that.
Yeah, well, one thing that Trump is doing in the Justice Department and really throughout the federal government, the Justice Department less so than some other branches or some other departments, is just firing a ton of people. So he's fired something like 250,000, 300,000 people, or that's the total decline of the federal government, because he's also hired a few people. And as you mentioned, those hirings are being now subjected to loyalty tests. So everyone applying for a federal job at above a certain pay grade, and it's a pretty low pay grade, has to answer an essay question that is basically, how will you advance the goals of the Trump administration? So that's kind of a problem. And then, he's fired in the Justice Department particularly. He has fired a lot of people that were involved in investigations into himself. So that seems pretty direct, just vindictiveness against people that he sees as his enemies. And then he's also fired the civil rights division of the DOJ has declined by like 75%. So a lot of people have left that particular agency or that particular oversight power. Yeah, so that is, and just part of the whole idea of civil service back in 1883 was to protect government bureaucrats from being fired. That was prior to that, there was the spoil system, and the spoil system was basically the president comes in, he fires everybody and hires whoever he wants, hires his own loyalists. It doesn't really fire everybody. I mean, Andrew Jackson was famous for doing this in 1828, and he was only 10% of the federal workforce. But still, that's a pretty large chunk of the federal workforce. And these people were supposed to be protected, and that has not really played out very much in the Trump administration, in part because the courts have not stepped up to prevent these mass firings, and have at least allowed them to continue in a lot of cases without holding full hearings. So the Supreme Court has said, okay, you can go ahead and fire these people while we're deciding whether you can fire these people. And then, of course, maybe a couple of years from now, they'll get around to saying, no, you can't fire most of the Department of Education. But by that point, it's already happened. All those people lost their jobs long ago. So, at least in the short term, it's Trump has been allowed to, fire whoever he wants.
Yeah, I mean, the timelines of this, is tough. It doesn't always work out well for us. So the other side of that, though, I mean, is this idea that, the executive was supposed to have a lot of power, and they do have a mandate, and therefore all this stuff is the right way to do it. There's been reported that there's this slang that has arisen in the current administration. They talk about being Article 2'd, which is where if you were fired because you were not seen as sort of actively supporting the agenda enough, then you get fired. And that really relies on this sort of expansive view of Article 2 powers. And how do historians view that balance? The DOJ, is it really meant to be a direct extension of the president's democratic mandate, or is it supposed to be something that's more insulated? And how do you see that from a historian's perspective?
Yeah, well, so let's do a little civics 101 here. Three branches of government. Legislative branch creates the law. The judicial branch is supposed to interpret the law. And the executive branch, the reason it's called the executive branch is because it executes the law. So Congress decides to do something. They say, we want to give pensions to Civil War widows, or we want to make cocaine illegal. And somebody's got to do that work, right? Somebody's got to figure out who the Civil War widows are and write them a check. There just needs to be an office for that. Somebody's got to investigate cocaine trafficking and figure out who to prosecute for the crime and do the actual prosecution. So all of that is within the executive branch. Now, it's worth mentioning, you're saying it's Article 2, and Trump famously said, I'm not sure I'm going to quote quite right, but that I have an Article 2 that allows me to do whatever I want. But it's Article 2, right? So Article 1 is about Congress. And I think most historians would agree that the original design of the U.S. Government was that the legislative branch was really supposed to be the primary branch. There's this idea of co-equal branches, and they are supposed to check and balance each other. But from the legislature was the most representative, or that was the idea, because it's representing all the different parts of the country, and especially at the beginning, the founders were very concerned about sort of geographic representation. But so Congress is supposed to generate the laws, and then somebody's got to execute them. Somebody's got to oversee that department, that is, the various departments that are doing all the various things. But originally there was less of an idea that the president would have a lot of power to interpret the law in different ways. And a lot of this is because the federal government was a lot smaller. So today, the federal government, including the military, is 5 million people. That's a big, it's the largest employer in the United States is the federal government. Back in Andrew Jackson's time, it was 10,000 people. Still a pretty decent sized organization, but it is just a much larger organism now, and it does a lot more things than it did at the origin of the country. And part of that is that Congress is, we have a much more complex economy, we have more complex laws, so Congress it's more complicated to say we want to prevent harmful chemicals from being released into the air and water. And that's a more technical question. You got to get some scientists and experts on board to help you figure out what the harmful chemicals are, to figure out, what is possible to regulate, how you're going to monitor this stuff. So then you end up with the EPA, which is a larger agency with more technical expertise, and then there's this real question of, well, so the president is supposed to execute the law. The president is supposed to oversee the EPA and all the other departments doing all the things, but where does the line stop between interpreting the law and, intentionally misinterpreting the law? You're still supposed to protect the environment in the Environmental Protection Agency. You can't just say, okay, this agency is the Energy Production Agency now, and we drill for oil. You still have to execute the laws. And so that's kind of how the whole system was structured over the last. It's not just Trump, for sure. There's been this shift in power towards the executive branch, really for a long time now. Certainly starting in the early 20th century, with World War I, World War II, big expansions of kind of the executive offices of the country. And some of that is just because it's a more complicated government doing more stuff. So to some extent, it's maybe even inevitable that with more and more offices doing more and more complex things, that the executive branch was going to grow in power. But that's really on steroids today, where Congress, they barely pass any laws anymore, let alone investigate the executive branch. And the judicial branch is in some ways seizing power for itself, but in a lot of ways it's just saying, executive branch, do whatever you want. So that is certainly not how things were envisioned as part of the original design of the country.
Yeah, I mean, as you note, the courts have been pretty hesitant to restrict the executive branch, kind of citing that the president has a mandate from the voters to execute their policies. And so, this gets us back to when we spoke to James Goodwin in the Imperial Presidency episode. He talked about, how if it comes to a battle between the court and the executive, that would be like two suns colliding. And, if the courts either won't step in or maybe can't enforce their own rulings, and, impeachment seems to be the remedy the founders put in there. But in our political environment, impeachment seems like an impossibility. I mean, what's left to hold the line?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think elections are still how, if we are any kind of democracy, elections are the ultimate backstop. I mean, that's how you hold power accountable. I have some questions about how free and fair the election this year is going to be. And I think, there's no such thing as a perfect election. It's pretty complicated to count tens of millions of votes and keep it all anonymous and make sure. So that, the election system is secure. It is, the votes are counted accurately. But there's plenty of little ways and maybe medium-sized ways that elections aren't fully accountable. So there's policies about voter ID that exclude a lot of people. There's voter roll purges, various policies that make it hard for every portion of the people to vote. Gerrymandering certainly is part of that. So, but elections are the ultimate way that we're supposed to hold power to account. I think the Trump immunity decision from a couple of years ago from the Supreme Court is very damaging. It's just broad immunity for anything the president can plausibly claim is related to his office. So that means it's almost impossible to hold a president accountable legally in a way that isn't true. You can prosecute a senator or a House member, but not the president. And, there's a lot of other examples around the world of successful democracies. So I think the Supreme Court was worried about, or said they were worried about, this idea of kind of kangaroo courts. And there's just going to be, each administration will try the previous one, and that is a concern. But now they've created a system where it's almost impossible to hold the executive branch to account legally. And then Congress, at least recently, isn't working too hard to investigate or, hold them to account legislatively. So that leaves elections.
Well, that's not super. It's not super good news to hear. I guess I'm trying to figure out if there is anything structurally that we need to start thinking about, reforms to some of this. Like just the fact that you say that, as you say, that because there's so many laws and that they're so complicated, and because the president, due to Article 2, that's the branch that enforces the laws, that it requires this large administrative state to do that. But that implies some goodwill and some, adhering to norms and things like that to not selectively enforce those laws. And it seems like the framers just left everything to impeachment. That's like the only mechanism besides elections for a rogue, president that isn't adhering to those norms. And again, I still like to come back to that argument that someone on a conservative side might say, it's like, no, he's got the right to do this. He was elected. People wanted this mandate. And again, in a 50+1% environment, I don't know if mandate's really the word we should even be using, but, because that's not exactly how that works. But, and especially when you do polling today and find that, large percentage of these individual policies are not particularly popular. So is that really a mandate? But that's the argument from the other side that, all of this kind of trying to curtail the president is not democratic.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out that the president is not the only elected office at the national level. So, as I said earlier, Congress was really supposed to be the primary branch creating the law. So, if anybody has electoral legitimacy, it's Congress more than the president, at least as the the original design of the Constitution. Yeah, in terms of what reforms might be possible, I so I might be getting out over my skis here because I
Yeah.
don't. This is not something I've heard other people say, but there was a decision a couple years ago at the Supreme Court, Loper Bright, that overturned Chevron deference, and what that was Chevron deference was this idea that the courts should defer to the executive branch. So if there's any ambiguity, so Congress passes a law and says, whatever, I'll go back to the EPA. We're, regulating the amount of lead you can put in your water or whatever. And, or maybe it's not even that clear. It's just, we're regulating the, harmful chemicals you can put in your water. And then somebody's got to determine how to interpret that, what counts as a harmful chemical, what level of it is harmful, how all that stuff. And Chevron deference was a longstanding legal principle that said the courts had to defer to the executive branch. So if the executive branch had a plausible interpretation where they say, we don't think this chemical is that harmful, and these levels are fine, or we think this chemical is super harmful, and that could change administration to administration. The law doesn't change, but the interpretation could. And then what the court did was get rid of that and say, okay, we, the court, are going to be in charge of deciding that. And in some ways, that's certainly more power to the judicial branch. In some ways, that's more power to the, it's certainly less power to the executive branch. And, at the time, a lot of the concern about this decision was that it would disempower experts in the executive branch, and that is definitely a concern. So you have scientists at the EPA saying, "No, I know what's harmful," and you, judge, don't understand this stuff as well as I do. But it also does give a little bit more of a check on the executive branch being able to interpret whatever it wants willy-nilly. So it's possible that that some of this stuff could get blocked through courts, but that's a slow process. I don't know what reforms will come out of this moment. There were major reforms after Watergate, after Teapot Dome, but in both of those cases, those were scandals that were widespread realization. The broad public agreed that something had gone wrong, and that allowed for large electoral majorities, or at least the threat of large electoral majorities. I don't think we're in the same place today. I think a lot of Americans feel that what's happening in the Trump administration, and in particular in the Justice Department, is a scandal, is a crisis. I believe that. But I don't know if we have enough national agreement on that to make widespread reform possible, and I'm pretty worried about what that means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a great lead into sort of this core challenge. This idea that we could be heading into a pretty scary feedback loop here, or a spiral. If the public loses faith in the neutrality of the DOJ, which I think a large percent of the public has already, the response from the political opposition isn't sort of necessarily just a return to norms. It can be something more like just use the same tools against them, right? I mean, and you're seeing for these kind of calls in the Democratic Party today, when they've regained power, and if they were to regain power. Let's say, for instance, we have all these purges that we talked about with that has left mostly MAGA loyalists throughout the executive branch. So would look more like the spoil system, but maybe on steroids. Would a Democratic president be bold enough to do the same thing and have their own loyalty tests and then fire all those MAGA people? And should they? I mean, is that the president we want? And if these legal frameworks alone can't fix this, like how, and the informed norms have sort of gone out the window, how do we break that kind of cycle?
Well, if I knew the answer to this, I am pretty worried about that. And I think it's important that we don't get into a vindictive cycle. So how do we do it? I think there's one element of it is public accountability. I mean, I come back to elections, so I think I don't think the public really wants that. I mean, an easier example, maybe, and this isn't DOJ, but is gerrymandering. I mean, gerrymandering is not popular. People don't like it, and it is really increasing. So there has been, as we all know, a spate of mid-decade redistricting this year to try to maximize partisan advantage. Which I think the Republicans started it in Texas, but the Democrats have been, willing participants. And it's just contributing to a situation where very few House seats are even competitive anymore. That's terrible for democracy. It's also very unpopular. And so possibly that is something that the public could get upset enough about that legislation could be passed, and that there would be bipartisan, at least among the public, bipartisan agreement that this is bad, this is a problem we need to fix. And possibly the same could be true about the civil service in Washington. Now, it's not that Trump has fired everybody. He's fired 250,000 or 300,000 or a little bit more than that because he's hired some people. But out of a federal workforce of about 2 million in the civilian federal workforce, not including the Postal Department. So it's a big chunk, but it's not everybody. So there's plenty of people who have been career civil servants. And in fact, he can't fire everybody because they couldn't hire people fast enough. What happens if a Democrat takes the White House? I mean, I think a fear that I have, and not to be partisan here. I mean, I think that there's legitimate arguments for conservative and progressive policies, but it is, if the argument is about the size of government, it's a lot easier to smash institutions than it is to create them. So there will be, after this, one of the advantages of federal jobs in the past has been they pay pretty well, but in a lot of sectors, they don't pay competitively with the private sector. And, but job security was supposed to be one of the things. You get a federal job, and as long as you don't, give them a reason to fire you for cause, that's a secure job. That is no longer true. I mean, that is going to be a presumption that's going to make it hard to restaff federal agencies. Who's going to want to go work for the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department if the next Republican president is going to fire you again? So it's going to be hard to rebuild that expertise, and that's a case where I fear there's kind of an imbalance of power, imbalance of the effectiveness of that tactic between the two parties, between trying to build government institutions that do things and trying to dismantle government institutions that do things. So I really don't know. I mean, I think this will be a major question, presuming that Trump is leaving the White House after this term, which he is constitutionally barred from running again, and without saying anything about the next election, but sooner or later we should have a change of parties in power. If we don't have that, then we probably aren't a democracy. And I think this will be a major question for whoever the next Democrat is to occupy the White House, is how to try to protect that federal workforce so that it can't just be smashed again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as this hostility builds, they're going to have to somehow appease that angry segment of their own party while hopefully not tearing the country apart.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that a lot of this has to come legislatively, and that's scary because Congress isn't doing too much lately. But that is a thing that Congress can do, is kind of set the rules for the civil service. And that's the thing they did back when they got rid of the spoils system and created civil service, way back in the late 19th century. Now, I do not want to defend the way Trump has treated the federal bureaucracy. I do think there is an argument against civil service reform, which is, so the Jacksonian argument for the spoils system was, so the spoils system was, partisan loyalists get handed federal jobs. They were expected to basically tie the percentage of their income, like up to 10% of their income was supposed to go to contribute to political candidates. And they were also expected to be part of political campaigns. So people based in Washington, D.C. would be given leaves of absence, paid leaves of absences during elections so they could go home and be part of the campaign. And that all sounds corrupt, and it was corrupt. But what Jackson said is it brings government closer to the people. So it meant that everyday people, who had partisan loyalties, but not necessarily education, were able to step into those jobs and that they had maybe a more understanding of what everyday Americans were like. And in fact, when civil service reform started, there is evidence that the class of civil servants, in economic class, more of them came from wealthier backgrounds, fewer of them came from poorer backgrounds. So I think, I think we've relied on this idea of merit in this country, both in this realm and in a lot of realms, where there's this idea of I have earned my privileges because I got an elite education, and that kind of ignores the fact that I got an elite education because my parents got an elite education, and I was given a lot of privileges growing up, and maybe I even got alumni access to college. So I think this idea of merit is one that we should be rethinking as a country. If you look at Trump's executive orders to abolish DEI within the federal government and also to try to decrease regulation of affirmative action in in private businesses, both of those executive orders have the word merit in them. So he is trying to claim this idea of we need to get rid of this stuff. We need to get back to merit. And that's also what, Democrats are saying. And there's a lot of merit to merit, and you do need experts in expert positions. But I do think it's important that everyone has access to these jobs, and just having a civil service exam isn't enough. And that's why we had affirmative action programs in government, was to say we're not just going to rely on the exam. We're going to make sure that these jobs are distributed more widely and more equitably. And that has had an effect. In the 70s, like 97% or something like that of the federal workforce was white. That's of the executive level. That's sort of the highest level of the federal government was 97% white. And that starts to come down, and that matters. So yeah, I think we have some big questions to ask ourselves as a country about how we can build government agencies that are effective, and also how we can staff them in a way that's fair and representative of the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we're pushing against the clock a little bit, but I don't know. Do you have a moment to maybe give us sort of
sure? I got all the time in the world
to put some of this like in a historical perspective, and like maybe we're all overreacting, and maybe the system, and maybe this is just a cycle that America's in.
It would be nice if we were all overreacting. I mean, I do think that this country has been through a lot. My particular area of historical expertise, the thing I studied in grad school was antebellum, was just before the Civil War. And so often when I look at politics today, I think, oh, well, it's just like it was back then. But then, we also had a civil war. So that's maybe not the most hopeful thought. And the Civil War was the bloodiest war. I mean, more Americans died in that war than any other war we've ever fought. And it was against ourselves. And of course, it was important. The abolition of slavery was an incredible achievement for this country, very important for this country. But obviously, this country has been through moments of deep division. And I think we are at a moment of high polarization again. And I think that's going to be a difficult cycle to break out of. And that doesn't just implicate government. That's about the media we consume. That's about the education we receive in schools. That's about the communities we live in, which are increasingly ideologically sorted. That we're, when we're only hanging out with people that agree with us, then we're not really, we have exaggerated views of the other side. And that is true on both the right and the left, that they have inaccurate and exaggerated views of the opinion on the other side. So that is the most hopeful thing I think about this moment, is that at the leadership level, I do see a lot of the things that the Trump administration is doing as dangerous. I think it is very dangerous to use the Justice Department to prosecute political enemies and to protect political friends. That is very dangerous. That's not what the average Republican believes or wants. So I think if we can, the hope that I have is that the public does not want, they don't want the vindictiveness and the extremity that's happening in government. And I hope at the end of the day that brings us back to a more peaceful country, which we all want.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you very much for all of this. Thank you so much for making time for us, Alex Lovit.
Well, thank you for having me.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. You can find Alex's podcast, The Context, by searching The Context on your podcast app or by visiting kettering.org/The Context. Get links to everything and contact information at outrageoverload.net. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.